So this is Jonathan Angulo on March 19th, 2024 at 3:39 p.m. conducting an interview for the A Global Oral History of PEPFAR project. To begin, could you start off by introducing yourself and establishing your connections to PEPFAR and what years you worked for or in partnership with PEPFAR?
Sure. So I'm Adrienne Parrish Fuentes. I currently work in the private sector for a private company doing global public policy work. My work with PEPFAR was some time ago. It was I worked directly with PEPFAR over the course of about 10 years. Um, and there were different spurts of time. So it was from around like 2004 to 2006. I worked in Washington on the Global AIDS program, the headquarters PEPFAR office. And then I also worked in a couple different countries as what's called a PEPFAR coordinator, leading the interagency team to implement the PEPFAR program. And I did that from around 2008 to 2013 in Nigeria first, and then in Namibia. And then interspersed in that time, I've also worked indirectly on PEPFAR, so working in foreign aid more broadly or foreign assistance within the US government, and then also in health policy in China, which had actually a PEPFAR program, and that was in 2016 to 2021. I led the Health and Human Services team in China in Beijing at the U.S. Embassy there, and the CDC team was still implementing a small PEPFAR-funded HIV program when I was there as well. So that was I was able to kind of participate in the program pretty recently then as well, just from that perspective. So yeah,
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
That's very interesting and
different
very
roles and yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So now that we've established kind of your role with PEPFAR, some of the next questions are just going to be a little personal, kind of just to break the
Yeah,
ice.
yeah, yeah.
So
Sure.
please briefly tell us about yourself and your family. Where and where were you born? Where did you go to
Oh,
school, etc.?
okay. Yeah, sure. Let's see. Gosh. So where was I born? I was born in Iowa. I am the oldest of three daughters. I um I didn't grow up in Iowa though. We moved to Oklahoma and then Dallas. I lived in Dallas as a child, like for elementary and the beginning of kind of junior high. In East Dallas actually, which is where I live now. It's all kind of come full circle. Um, and then spent a lot of my life in Massachusetts as well. So I tell people that was my first like international experience, was like living in Texas and Massachusetts as a child. Um but yeah, no, then yeah, lived in a small town in Massachusetts, went to college in Philadelphia, went to University of Pennsylvania, studied international relations and Japanese. Um, and and then after college, I like went off and explored the world and did some overseas experiences. I was mostly interested in Asia at the time and studying like post World War II Japan. And so I was really focused on national security and that kind of thing, and then ended up in DC. Um, yeah, and ended up I had done an internship in college actually, which took me to DC, like a semester in Washington, and so it started my kind of network, and so that's how I ended up at the State Department, um, working in a different role, and then had found out about PEPFAR. PEPFAR had started at the time that I was working at the State Department, and so that's kind of how that initially connected.
Okay.
Is that what you asked me?
Yeah, no, that's very good.
You can, yeah.
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 And you kind of already kind of elaborated a little bit on it from your internship to Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah.
But tell us a little bit about your career background.
Oh, yeah. Well, I started out, yeah, more on sort of the like national security side of international relations. And had studied abroad in Japan in college and did a DC semester, and so had a kind of an initial network and really enjoyed Washington DC. So decided to go there after college and work for a bit before I went back to grad school, and um, was working doing some consulting and working at a it was back in the time of the like tech tech boom company, tech companies. There were even some outside of DC, so I did that a little bit, and then had an opportunity to go work at the State Department for the Deputy Secretary of State. It was during the time, so it was during when George W. Bush was president. Colin Powell was Secretary of State, and his deputy at the time was a gentleman named Richard Armitage. And so I worked for him as a staffer, like I was in my early 20s, and had this incredible experience to get to like see what foreign policy making was like in DC. And towards the end of Colin Powell's time, and I uh, well, PEPFAR had begun, and I had been volunteering in DC, um, and in a HIV organization called the Whitman Walker Clinic, and they provide a lot of sort of care and support services to people in Washington D.C. Who had HIV or AIDS at the time. And I had a family member who had been diagnosed with HIV back in the like late 70s, early 80s. And he had been doing quite well. And I was just interested in like the disease and what happened to people, like from a sort of scientific side, and then actually from a just your life side. And that's kind of what I learned volunteering in DC. And then because I was at the State Department, it was kind of this convergence of like the foreign policy and the health issues. And so I had an opportunity to go work on PEPFAR, and got to do that and see that up front at sort of the headquarters level at the State Department for a few years before I went overseas. So
Okay.
that's kind of how it started.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Um, and a little bit about the next question is, right, you already kind of answered it, but can you tell us like specifically like how you came to work on HIV issues and PEPFAR in
Yeah.
particular? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it really was that, like I said, like that kind of convergence of like my background and interest in international relations or foreign policy, and then my personal interest in volunteering in my community in DC, volunteering on and learning about HIV. And I didn't really, well, not really, I didn't know at all really anything about like the global HIV situation really
Mm-hmm.
at the time. That was in 2003, 2004, I guess, when I learned. When I started working on at the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator, which is like the headquarters office that managed and led the PEPFAR program.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I just was in the right, it was in a place at the time that was right for me. And I had an opportunity to, I was like a program manager, what they call program management staff on PEPFAR, and we were doing a lot of sort of analysis about the early years of PEPFAR and sort of how the success of the program, and taking that data and information to the Office of Management and Budget at the White House and to Congress, to kind of show them what the results of the program were. At that time, they were called focus countries and non-focus countries. Yeah, that kind of thing. So we were doing a lot of sort of analysis, and I got to help work on that. So
Okay. I mean, that's definitely terrific,
yeah,
right? Because one of the things we're trying to understand is it came in right at the time that PEPFAR came into being.
yeah,
And one of the things we're trying to find out is like the quantitative methods, right, that they talked about.
right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your project management role and working to inform the Office of Management?
Yeah, they were, so the program from the very beginning, right, was you can read about it. It's like was a very um both sides of Congress were super supportive of it, right? Like it wasn't Democrats and Republicans were super supportive of it in Congress, and it was a lot of money that was allocated. I don't remember all the numbers right now off the top of my head, but we used to talk about it a lot, like of hundreds of millions of dollars over like the first 5 years of the program when it
Mm.
was initially launched, right? And because it's a lot of funding, there was a lot of accountability um, expected,
Right.
and so you know there were multiple U.S. government agencies implementing the program, and so different government agencies have their own ways of sort of um, measuring success, right? Like having indicators, right? Monitoring and evaluation systems and strategic information. And what we had to do at the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator at the beginning, and some of the information that I wasn't an M&E or monitoring and evaluation expert, but I would work with those folks to be able to describe, in words that that non technical people would understand, like,
Yeah.
um, you know, what kind of results we were seeing, especially like, how many people were receiving treatment, especially how many people in the focus countries, especially were receiving care services, were receiving prevention services. There was a lot of emphasis on orphans and vulnerable children because of the just the dramatic challenge of so many people dying, that you had so many orphans, and so that was a really big part of the emphasis of the original beginning of the program. And yeah, so it was really just to describe kind of how the indicators were attached to the money, and so the success of the program. So the White House has annual budget processes, and so you have to sort of feed that information into the process so that you can justify the continuing, allocation of funds every year, even though it was even though it was appropriated, or no, it was allocated for a 5-year, authorized for a 5-year. Just because it's authorized doesn't mean you get the money, right? You have to go through the annual appropriations process from Congress and the White House to actually get the money into the agencies to do the programming. So it's sort of a constant cycle of justifying the money, showing your results. So I was able to work with all the budget people and the M&E people and sort of try to write up and tell that story to those other audiences to help us keep getting our money.
No, yeah.
Which was important, because you want to make sure you're justifying how you're using the money. It's taxpayer dollars, and it was a lot of funding.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then do you have any sense of kind of where the information and data was coming from? Was it coming from the host countries, the Office of Global AIDS and Management?
No, so the data and the information would come from, well, where we would receive it in at the State Department, in the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator's office. We would get it from the agencies that were in country. So we had CDC staff. So say you're in Nigeria or South Africa, we could pick either one. Say you're in one of those countries and you're working usually in the capital, and so you have that funding is going to implementing partners like NGOs or large implementing organizations, but it's funded through either CDC or USAID, or the Peace Corps had some programming, but that was a different kind of model. And the Defense Department had a program, also a different model, but they would work with local militaries as well in the countries, in the host country. So the original data would come from the implementing partner or the government if we were giving money to the government, which at the very beginning, there really wasn't money going directly to governments from PEPFAR. It was going to partners and large NGOs at first, and other types of partners that would do the work. And then they would collect data. The data would go to the agency in the country, and then that U.S. government agency would report it to Washington, to the State Department.
Yeah, that's
And it'll all
fascinating.
get collated. It's just this big, yeah. I guess we did annual reports and semi-annual reports. Yeah, and the data would come in that way.
Yeah.
And then there was a big annual planning cycle. People have heard of the COP, or the Country Operational Plan. Everyone in PEPFAR has, laughed and cried over that document
Yeah.
over many years. But yeah, there was a lot of planning and reporting
Okay.
required. Yeah.
And then again, you might not know the answer to this, but do you have a sense of like when the money started moving from CDC staff and NGOs into particularly national governments in the host countries?
I mean, to be honest, it's not really the model of the U.S. government when we do foreign aid at all. And when I say foreign aid, I mean any funding that either goes into the foreign assistance budget, or like the health budget, that's being executed in another country. We don't usually give it directly to a government. It's like across lots of different foreign aid, so not just for PEPFAR, but CDC might be the closest thing to an exception to that, because the CDC model of implementing, they would oftentimes, the CDC offices would, for lack of a better word, be embedded, like at the Ministry of Health offices in a country, but the money is being implemented by like either the CDC people or the partners. It's not often or ever. I don't want to say ever, because there's always something that's probably there, an exception. But the model was really not to give money directly to a government. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, that's
so
good.
that's the model, right? Like the
That's good to know.
PEPFAR. So the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. You'll about the Global Fund. I'll just refer it to as the Global Fund. The Global Fund was also launched just before PEPFAR, right?
Right.
And so that model was a different model.
Mhm.
And so there's always this sort of discussion about like, the model of how you bring funding into another country and implement it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the models were different.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying on that. And then, as you worked through your time working as a project manager for the PEPFAR and working with the agencies, what was your knowledge of Africa before you came to work
Oh,
on PEPFAR?
oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nothing. I mean, nothing like substantive, I would say. Like I had never been to the continent. I had never, yeah, I had never been to the continent of Africa before I joined the PEPFAR team in Washington. And I had studied in college, like I mentioned, I had studied Japanese and a lot of Asian cultures, but specifically I lived in Japan, but really had not, but yeah, had not studied Africa, didn't, you know, maybe know some things from movies, but like that was very, not real,
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I really didn't. It was, and PEPFAR is how I learned about Africa, about the continent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, because you worked with PEPFAR really early in its launching,
Hmm.
can you tell us about some of the major players? Were many of where they're working, were many of them aware of their work in like designing something new? Like, can you tell us a little bit about that? And that's okay if you don't.
Well, I mean, players. You mean? I mean, I think the main ones that I worked with at the time, especially at the beginning, were like a lot of the U.S. government agencies. Right? It was headquartered at the State Department, but CDC, USAID, Peace Corps, DoD, like lots of different U.S. government agencies were involved. And then, of course, we would go and brief the White House and try to, and manage OMB, and then also Congress. So Congress, we were constantly, um, sort of in that relationship to ensure that they understood what was happening. And then so UNAIDS, the UN the UN body that sort of puts out overall policy around HIV and put out data around HIV. So work really closely with UNAIDS, and then the Global Fund that I mentioned, especially because the Global Fund, the U.S. government also allocated every year. Congress would allocate funds to the Global Fund as well. So we did bilateral programming through PEPFAR, and then the multilateral programming was through the Global Fund into the same countries. So you had to plan that together, right? Um, and then civil society. So like civil society is it's always kind of, I don't know, a bit of a strange word to me because it captures all kinds of organizations, right? So at the time that I was there initially, and even when I was overseas later with in countries, um, a lot of work at the time with faith-based organizations, with people living with HIV and AIDS, advocacy groups. In Washington, and I mean, I was based in Washington at the time, so really I saw that from like the DC based, kind of
Hmm.
view. When I went out and lived later and worked in a couple of countries, I had different experiences and engaged with more folks as well. But yeah, there were a lot of players.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there was.
those aren't all of that. Those are like also the implementing partners that I mentioned earlier. So like that those funds are actually getting to you know John Snow Inc. or University of Washington, like these really big FHI 360, like so a lot of these big sort of global health implementing partners who at the very beginning of PEPFAR, because it was so much money and the contracting process was such that it was going to sort of bigger partners who were established and were already doing some of this work like on prevention of mother to child transmission because that was like the early program for HIV prevention.
Mhm.
um, yeah.
Yeah, we
you
we're hitting on
can just interrupt me anytime.
no, we're hitting on some of those topics,
Yeah.
especially in the early
Mhm.
history of PEPFAR.
Yeah.
And you just mentioned from mother to childhood prevention. What were the Bush administration's concerns in pushing for this new program, rather than working, as you said previously, like things like the Global Fund that were already existing global structures?
um Well, so I mean, so I when I arrived, all those decisions had already been made to like to launch the program, right? So it had already been funded, and um, then I arrived, and so my understanding though was that um, there was such a recognition. The core crux of the issue, right, was there was such a recognition that there was it was really access to medicine, which is actually an overarching topic that you can still talk about today in many different venues. And access to medicine at the time, access to treatment, to be super specific, access to antiretroviral treatment, that was occurring. You could get access to treatments in the United States at the time, but you could not get access to these drugs in the continent of Africa and some other countries where people were. I mean, let's be honest, they were dying for really no reason because the
Mhm.
drugs existed. The drugs existed in the world, right? So um, the early efforts were to really try to infuse a lot of money to get medicine out.
Okay.
That's an oversimplification, but that was really prevention and care, and the OVC, Orphans of Vulnerable Children program, was really important. PMTCT, prevention of mother to child transmission, that was a small program, I think mostly run through USAID before PEPFAR started. But it just wasn't funded at the levels that people wanted to see, like advocates wanted to see, and certain people within the US government it was like a rallying cry, my understanding. I wasn't part of that cry because I came in like after,
Right.
the rallying cry, but this is what I learned after I came in. Um, Part of that rallying cry to say that, this was happening in the world and we needed to do something about it. We
And
as in George W. Bush.
right,
We
yeah,
as in like the Bush administration, because
yeah,
that's who was the president at the time. And
yeah.
he, from learning then and learning what I learned later, that, he really believed personally that this dichotomy couldn't exist,
Hmm.
right? Where you have access to these drugs that are saving people's lives in the United States, and why wouldn't they have access in Zambia or South Africa or
Right.
Nigeria, for
Yeah,
example?
yeah.
Didn't make sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was a huge amount of money that was flowing into making
Yeah.
sure that that was there. And, you joined a little bit after, these important conversations about
Mm-hmm.
PEPFAR. And I'm not sure if you got a sense of it,
Mm-hmm.
but, PEPFAR was initially it wasn't initially in the State Department. So did you have a sense kind of like, the conflicts between, the State Department, the CDC, and other departments about PEPFAR's implementation? Did you kind of have any sense about that?
Yes. Yes, you can't really work on PEPFAR and not have a sense of, the, like, early conflicts. And I say that in jest a bit because so when PEPFAR was created, it was actually created at the State Department. So when the congressional authorization came through, the language read that this was to be established at the State Department because they wanted it to be an interagency coordinated effort, right? Because USAID had a role, CDC had a role, and DoD, Peace Corps, all of these agencies had an important role to actually be effective, to reach all of the people that the program wanted to reach and needed to reach. Um, but I'm sure that there was like pre-negotiations to get the language to read that way in the congressional authorization, right? So, um, yeah, no, I mean, so USAID folks wanted it to be fully run out of USAID. CDC at the time wanted to be fully run out of CDC because these are both agencies that have long, technical expertise. Sometimes different technical expertise. USAID has a lot of health expertise, but also that development expertise. Like, how do you partner with a country to work on projects that they want to have you work on? And of course, CDC, the premier public health institution, right? So they have just different models and different technical expertise. And so, yeah, that was a conflict from the beginning. But when PEPFAR was established, it was established at the State Department so that one agency was not in charge, so that it was coordinated explicitly, and the money went through the State Department. So the agencies would only receive those fundings if they all participated in that planning document. So like everybody had their allocations and their goals for how many people to put on treatment or how many orphans and vulnerable children were going to be brought into a program. But yeah, there was conflict
Yeah,
for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
We've
Yeah.
definitely
I
read
mean,
a lot
it's
about it.
yeah, I mean, it's not a secret, right?
Yeah, it's not a
Yeah.
secret.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
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 And then, because you were volunteering, with with AIDS organizations or an AIDS organization. How did you feel when you heard about the program's launch or you heard about PEPFAR?
Mhm.
And what was the atmosphere in DC around the program?
Um, honestly, like I only knew about the program, about PEPFAR because I was working inside the State Department at the time. My volunteer work, like at the Whitman Walker Clinic in DC, um, if I was just doing that and hadn't been working at the State Department in my other job, I would not have known about PEPFAR, I don't think. It wasn't, it wasn't something that was, I think, similar to, like, other, government programs, like federal programs that are in a faraway place. You don't really hear about it in the news. It's not like at the beginning where they were like, "Oh, we're doing this big program." I'm sure there were things that were happening, that there were announcements, but I wasn't aware. The only reason I was aware of the PEPFAR program was because I was working at the State Department.
Mm, okay, okay,
Yeah, it wasn't really through my volunteer, because
okay,
that was super focused on, it was super local.
right,
And anyway, and those things are interestingly sort of detached from one another, right?
okay, okay. That's
Yeah,
yeah, it's
which
interesting.
is, yeah, not necessarily a good thing, but that is how it was then.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense too, right? Because it's like a global emphasis where versus the United States, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right, like super local emphasis, yeah, like a local community organization. Like, they weren't receiving funding from the PEPFAR program, like, they weren't doing, they really weren't connected at all. If there were any connections over time between, like, local programming and global programming, it would be sort of the people who navigated, like, there were people who, um oh, I know are on your interview list. There are people who worked for, say, like, the Ryan White Care Act, which was the domestic-focused HIV program, right, in the United States, who then were advocates for the global for PEPFAR program, and then went and worked on the PEPFAR program. So the PEPFAR program really pulled a lot of, like, technical and leadership expertise from US domestic programs into the global PEPFAR space. But, like, the clinic that I worked at, in DC, didn't really touch any of that, at least
Yeah,
at the time.
yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the early years, working for PEPFAR, did you follow its 2008 reauthorization? And can you tell us a little bit about how that unfolded, if you do remember?
So in 2008, I was, um, in the, office of the director of foreign assistance. So I went from working at the PEPFAR Global AIDS Coordinator office at the State Department to the, Office of Foreign Assistance, which was, like, also a startup, within the State Department, where we were looking across at all of foreign assistance, and how, that was planned and implemented. And then I took a job as the PEPFAR coordinator in Nigeria. So I wasn't, part of the reauthorization process really at all, because it was DC based, but I was in a different office in DC working on broad foreign assistance programs. And then I went out to Nigeria, and I wasn't involved in, folks out in the country really weren't involved in the reauthorization process, unless, like, they would come and ask us, like, some kind of questions maybe that a congressional staffer had or a congressperson had. But I wasn't directly involved in that process.
Did
I know it was intense.
yeah,
It is a very intense process, and um, but I wasn't directly involved in it, so
do you remember
I'm
any
not.
kind of the stories or anything that colleagues or just things that you would read on the news about the first reauthorization?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I know it was, I mean, for me, and because I was also involved in it in DC and then went overseas, I mean, it was obviously a big deal. There was a big push to have it be reauthorized. Um, but I can't say that I remember, like, the policy issues involved, if that's what you're, if that what you're thinking about. Are you thinking about any specific topics? I mean, Obama is a different president, right?
Mhm.
Also, so, like, the Obama administration had its own, um, had, how should I say, like, had its own, every administration that has come in after the first PEPFAR, after George W. Bush, if it's a different president, if it's a Republican or a Democrat, or, whatever the leadership is, there's sort of a different, I don't know, like, a little bit of a different sort of flavor added, like, to the policy process, right? Like, an emphasis areas. And so I can't say that. So during 2008, when we were out in country, there was an emphasis on what we called back then partnership frameworks. So like, how do we really better in this next phase of PEPFAR partner more closely with the countries that we're in um, to achieve the goals of not just PEPFAR, but of the country and sort of the global AIDS, global HIV goals. So that part I remember, like the
Yeah.
partnership piece was more emphasized with the host countries.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just asking you what you
Yeah,
remember from memory.
but yeah, I know. But otherwise, yeah, like at the time, because I had just come from, I was kind of focused on broader foreign aid in DC, and then but when I went to Nigeria, that's what we were focused on. But the reauthorization intensity and like going to the Hill, like I didn't participate in any of that. Also, 2008, my daughter was 1, and so I had not slept in a year. So probably like memories for between like 2007 and 2008 are not things that I will likely be able to like.
Yeah, of course.
Lack of sleep is a form of torture. So yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what I remember that time. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So you kind of transitioned us really nicely into your role as you transition from the United States to the continent of Africa. But before we talk about and have that conversation, is there anything else that you wanted us to know about your experience working in the Office of Director of U.S. Foreign Assistance?
Um, I mean, I think the thing about that is that that was also connected to PEPFAR in 2 ways. One, the first head of PEPFAR, as in the global AIDS coordinator, Randall Tobias, he became the first U.S. director of foreign assistance. So when like he was tapped by the president to go and be to bring all of the foreign assistance together, similar to how the PEPFAR model, but to look at all of foreign assistance and development programs across the U.S. government. So he was the global AIDS coordinator, and then he was asked to be this other coordinator. So he took a few staff people from the PEPFAR global AIDS coordinator office with him to start this new office. So I was one of those people. So, and maybe 4 or 5 other ones were like the launch team. So that office of the director of foreign assistance at the State Department was really connected to PEPFAR in terms of like some of the people went there to start this other office. But then, PEPFAR continued on with its own sort of planning processes, and then the rest of foreign and development assistance sort of operated separately. So they weren't really connected super well. And then, so that's maybe the only thing to like draw that connection there. But we did then use the country operational plan model for the rest of foreign assistance. They were just called operating plans instead of country operating plans. Don't ask me why these distinctions were made. It's lots of old stories and fights, but yeah. So that model was the PEPFAR model of doing strategic planning and coordination was then used in that office, that director of foreign assistance, which that system that still exists today. So I mean, PEPFAR does as well, and so does the foreign assistance office at the State Department. Anyway,
Okay.
long time ago. Yeah,
Tell us a
it's
little bit.
feeling like
Tell us a little bit about your experience
so.
working with Randall Tobias or Tobias. Is it Tobias or Tobias?
Tobias.
Tobias, yeah.
Yeah, Tobias. So I worked with Tobias when he was the global AIDS coordinator at PEPFAR, right under him, and he was right. He had come directly from Eli Lilly to as the CEO of Eli Lilly into that role, and so I had worked on like for Colin Powell and Rich Armitage, like I'd worked for people who were like great leaders and very intense people, in a very intense like kind of Washington policy environment. So he was also, had high expectations for like, the accountability part of PEPFAR, which everybody had for the program. I'm not sure what else to say except for, and I mentioned that he then was he was called dual hatted. So he was the USAID administrator and the director of foreign assistance, which USAID did not like. It was not a decision that that whole agency or administration enjoyed. But he was, yeah, I mean, it was an intense time, and all the people were great that I worked with. he definitely was a CEO, so he had high expectations and, like, demand, but he wasn't much different than, like, other intense people that I had worked for.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's also, public knowledge how he left government, so, I was there at the time that
Yeah.
that happened as well. I was just about to have my first and only child, and so, yeah, so, stressful times, but the good thing is when you surround yourself with good people, which he had good staff and we had built a good team, he left government kind of, I'd say unexpectedly, and so they brought in a new leader and we continued on the work. So
Okay. Okay. I
life
just wanted
life goes on.
yeah. I just
Yeah.
wanted to ask that question, right? Because he was
Yeah.
really, yeah,
Yeah,
someone.
sure. Yeah, no, it was a strange experience, for sure, but, you can't dwell on it too much. There's, like, people's lives and money to get out. Like,
Yeah.
you're operating a program, so you kind of have to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah.
So now transitioning into your role, right, from the Office of Director of U.S. Foreign Assistance to being the country coordinator in Nigeria. Um, Tell us about the career transition, but also as well,
Mhm,
you said that you were having major life changes, right? Your daughter was born.
mhm.
Can you tell us about that career transition?
Yeah, so I had been in DC for some years at that point, like, maybe 8 or 9 years, which is longer than I've lived anywhere in my life, counting now even. It's the longest I've lived anywhere. It was 9 years in DC, like, after and, I, really wanted to after having worked on PEPFAR at DC level and working on this broad foreign assistance program, I really wanted to go out into a country where this money was flowing and find out, and just kind of understand what was really happening. Because when you're in DC, you get one perspective, just like in any job or any role or any experience, right? Like you have your perspective and that's it. You can try to understand what other people's perspective are and we went through that process all the time. But I really wanted to go out. I learn by doing better. Like I can read and talk to you and all those things, but I like to go and do and experience. And so for me, I think there was a role that opened up in Nigeria to be the country coordinator, and that means that you are responsible for strategically leading and coordinating the U.S. government interagency team, right? So you're placed at an embassy, you report to the ambassador, which is important. All those PEPFAR country coordinators report to the ambassador directly so that it is like a coordinated interagency environment, and you have the ambassador kind of it's got your back, when there's like fights over budget or whatever there is,
Yeah.
like and there's always going to be conflict um, and decisions that have to be made that not everybody will be happy with. And so, yeah, so I applied for the job and got it. And my husband at the time was up for it, which not all people are. My mother, I remember having the conversation with her. It was like on Mother's Day and my sister's like baby shower, and we were in Dallas actually at this hotel, and I was like, "So we're moving to Nigeria," and she was like, I mean, for like I had, for my mother who has never lived in another country before, really my family really hadn't. She was super supportive, and my family was super supportive. I think they were thought I was a little crazy, and, people are interesting too, like, when you talk to them about I remember, like, telling different people in my world, like friends or colleagues, like, "Oh, I'm going to move to Nigeria with my, like, 15-month-old daughter and my husband and our dog," our Labrador. Um, they have, like, had, like, visceral reactions, They were, either like, "Oh, that's super interesting, cool, like, da 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 da," or they were like, "What? You're doing what now? Like, you must have lost your mind." Um, but for me, like, I wouldn't go any I would never I wouldn't trade it for the world. Like, it was kind of diving in the deep end, and that was exactly the way that I like it. And it's the way that you know, I was young, so navigating, leading a US government team, that's very intense. I mean, I think our program when I was there, we were responsible for, like, almost $450 million of programming, which was one of the larger budgets. It was like South Africa, Nigeria were some of the bigger budget countries. So it was a lot of responsibility. And um, I think I was in my early 30s. And, you kind of land in a place and in a society that is very sort of hierarchical and male dominated. And so there's a lot of interesting, like, dynamics culturally that you have to like navigate and figure out. And yeah, it was awesome. I wouldn't trade it for the world. It was only 2 years. The posting is a short posting. Um, but I mean, I learned so much. I learned how to negotiate in Nigeria. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, that must have been incredibly difficult having to tell your family during Mother's Day, you know?
Yeah, I think it was Mother's Day weekend. Yeah, she was like, "Okay." And my sister's baby shower. Yeah, I remember coming to. We were in Dallas when I told her. Yeah,
Yeah,
not what I was thinking, but yeah,
yeah,
they handled it well.
yeah. And how were, you talked about working with the ambassador, right?
Mhm.
The
Yeah,
ambassador.
yeah,
How
yeah.
were the appointments made to the different countries for the ambassadors, in,
Like how our ambassadors
yeah,
appointed.
yeah.
So I mean, U.S. ambassadors are appointed in different ways in different countries. It depends. So they're mostly career foreign service officers. So, or they're a political appointee, which is appointed by the president. In around across the continent of Africa, um, I think right now there might be two political appointees, one in Kenya and one in South Africa, but it changes and it can change. The billets, they're called, can change. If a president comes in and is like, no, this country is like strategically important to my foreign policy, then they'll change it to a political billet and the president will appoint the ambassador. So
Mm.
like China is always a political appointee. The UK is, Paris is, South Africa is. So it's usually countries who are that have like important to the foreign policy of that president or that administration. So the ambassador that I reported to in Nigeria was a career foreign service officer.
Okay.
Um, I think Robin Sanders. I can't believe I remember her name. That's so crazy. I mean, because sometimes I think about like who are these people I worked with and for, and I have a hard time remembering names. But yeah, Ambassador Sanders. She was who I worked with in Nigeria. Yeah,
Yeah. And where exactly were you based in
we were
Nigeria?
in Abuja.
Okay.
So the U.S. Embassy in Nigeria is in Abuja, and then the consulate is in Lagos.
Okay.
um, which is about the same size in terms of the number of Americans that are. At least it used to be at that time. That embassy has changed a lot. Like right as we were leaving in 2010, there was actually the building that's just up the street from the embassy, which is where I would go like once a week at least to work with my World Bank and WHO and UNAIDS colleagues. Was bombed, and so like literally the week that we left, we were slated to leave. But there was a lot of increased levels of violence even in Abuja, which was usually pretty quiet.
Mhm.
And so the platform of the U.S. Embassy changed dramatically. Like right after I left, like family members weren't always coming, and that would have changed my calculus dramatically.
Yeah,
But
that
when we were
must.
there, it was quiet
Yeah.
in Abuja.
Mhm. I
Um,
mean, that must have been pretty
yeah, it
difficult.
was terrifying. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's scary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even when you're like about to leave, but you're worried. I mean, there are my colleagues that worked in that building and um uh yeah. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So this might have been maybe right when you were changing,
Mm.
but during the Obama years, right, the administration incorporated PEPFAR into the Department of State. How did that transition impact your position, or did it not impact your position in Nigeria?
So, PEPFAR was always at the Department of State.
Mm.
That didn't change during the
Okay.
Obama administration. Yeah.
Okay.
It was authorized originally. The original authorization was run out of the State Department. So the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator has always been at the State Department. Yeah. So actually I was in Nigeria when Obama was elected. That was a super cool experience to like be in the country. We had this big election party and
Yeah.
yeah, it was super interesting. I guess that was the end of 2008 because I got there in '07. Anyway, um yeah, and so it didn't that part didn't affect me because had always been a part of the State Department.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, we were working. I think I mentioned before, like the thing that was different during, or started that was renewed during the Obama administration was these partnership frameworks, like where we really worked even more closely with the host government to create this like joint strategy
Hmm.
and plan
Okay.
to tackling HIV in the country.
Okay.
So that was different or new, but we had already been part of the
Okay.
State Department part didn't change. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Lisa, that, yeah.
All right. And you already You already mentioned it, but the question is more about getting the details out.
Oh, sure.
Tell us
Try.
about incorporating country operational plans
Oh,
into PEPFAR.
well, so the COP. So if you say the COP to any like PEPFAR person who's ever worked on PEPFAR, they will have this like, like I don't want to say PTSD, but so the COP for PEPFAR was was from the beginning. So like in 2003, 2004, the first like initial COPs were done. So this is basically it's a country operating plan. It's like what is your plan to spend all this money that we're about to give you, like from headquarters? And so we did those every year as an annual budget process, like just like probably any organization that you're in. If you have a budget, you do an annual budget planning process. But there was an intensity around it because, again, like the accountability around the funding, and the intensity also had to do with which agencies were going to get the money and therefore which implementing partners were going to get the funding to do the actual work in the country, right? So it's like this cascade effect, right? So in Washington or headquarters, country numbers are negotiated like, oh, Nigeria is going to get this amount of money, South Africa is going to get this amount, Vietnam is going to get this amount. It's like your top line, you get one number. And so then they communicate to you and they're like, here's your out in the country, they're like, here's your budget number. Now send us back this detailed plan called the COP, country operating plan. And so then people meet with partners. What can you do this year? If we give you this amount of money, what can you achieve? And then you write it all up. You negotiate who's getting what money. What are your I don't like this word, but what are your targets? Like how many people are you going to put on treatment? How many people are you going to bring into care? How many infections are you going to prevent? Like the unmeasurable. That's a whole other conversation about, but but yeah, so it was like a 6 month long sometimes process,
Wow.
3 to 6 months, depending on how you ran it. Because we would hold meet. I mean, so the important part also was that you hear from stakeholders. So we would hold like, and I would lead, so the PEPFAR coordinator in the country, which I was in that role in Nigeria and Namibia, you would hold like stakeholder consultations, right? That would how you would kick off the COP process, the budget planning. So you would bring in civil society and host governments and advocacy groups, and you would hear from everyone about what their priorities are, how should we spend the money. It was a consultative process, which made it very long, but important. Like it was important to do that. Like if you didn't do that, then you can't really honestly say with a straight face that like you know you're that the plan had any I think like validity, right? Because you're in someone else's country, you're trying to do this work not for them but with them.
Hmm.
It's an important distinction, I think.
Yeah.
um yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, that's part of the COP process, but
Okay. And you had already said that there was already a COP in Nigeria. You didn't have to implement it because it had already started in 2003 and 2004. That's correct?
it's every year. You do
Every
it
year.
every year, a
Yeah.
new one.
Okay. And Nigeria already had one that you build off of, right?
Right. So
Okay.
yes,
Mhm.
yes.
Yeah.
So when I got there in 2008, they had the '07 one. So we would
Mhm.
look back at that and say, oh, what was the number last year? What did we achieve? Yeah. So you
Yeah.
had that to kind of look back at.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's good, right?
Not start for. Yeah, actually, that was helpful.
Uh,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
And then you already mentioned it, but I wanted to ask you more specifically, like who were some of like the major players working on the ground to
Mm,
develop and utilize, the COP in
mhm.
Nigeria, and what did that look like?
Oh, in Nigeria. Well, so in Nigeria, so again, all the agencies of the U.S. government and all the implementing partners, and I mentioned we would hold like stakeholder consultations, and the stakeholders would usually be um, in Nigeria, the government agency that we had worked with the Ministry of Health very closely, and then there was also this organization called NACA. It was like the Nigeria AIDS Coordinating Agency, NACA, and so there was a director general of that group, and so that person was also responsible for coordinating the HIV response across the Nigerian government, right? And so I worked very closely with him. Um, Gosh, I remember these people's names. It's so interesting. Like I think his name was Johnny Doko. Anyway, I worked with a lot of government agencies, Nigerian government agencies, especially Ministry of Health and NACA. Um, so we would consult with the government, of course, and then again, like other advocacy groups and NGOs, we would hold different consultations, like with faith-based groups. And in Nigeria, it's interesting. You have Muslim groups and Christian groups, and so that adds like another sort of dynamic um, as well. And then in Nigeria, especially, you have the different states. So then, right, you have then there's like conversations with local governments if you can. Sometimes that was difficult to do. Just because our travel would sometimes be limited in Nigeria where we could travel to. Um, and then the Global Fund. So the Global Fund, the Global Fund model I mentioned earlier, right, is different than what the PEPFAR model has always been. And so, but they have what's called a country coordinating mechanism, or the CCM, which is like a board model. And so, in that model you have, right, so we would consult with the Global Fund CCM. I actually sat on the CCM. So there's different people that are represented there, and then you make the decisions around the Global Fund money. So, and in that space also you have, the UN system, so the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, UNICEF especially. Those were the top three that I worked probably most closely with. Yeah. And then other governments, so like DFID, like the UK government was also giving some money. I don't think yeah, so there's sometimes other bilateral programming as well. And so we had like a development partners group for health. And so you would get together and like talk about what is everybody doing here?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, because you'd like, you don't want to implement programs that are duplicative and wasteful. And so you would try to coordinate with those other countries as well,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah.
So it was a lot.
It's no surprise it took 6 months.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that was sort of, working with those partners. Like the trick about all of that is that those relationships you're kind of fostering throughout the year, and those are people that you should be seeing regularly anyway. And so the COP process, like to develop the COP, um, if you already had the relationships you needed in place, developing the COP wasn't as difficult because then people kind of understood like it wasn't the first time you were ever talking to them, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it takes time to develop the relationships, though. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
but yeah.
And you've already hinted at it, but what tell us about the challenges and the benefits of developing and utilizing a comp.
The cop.
Yeah.
Um, oof. Hmm. Let's see. Well, the challenges usually were around not just looking at the one that you had the year before, which was helpful as a baseline, but actually trying to assess, like, is this still the right placement of these funds? Like, should we still be investing this much in like the treatment area? How much should we do? Male circumcision started coming up as a like primary prevention intervention, but at the beginning it was not approved in every country, right? So like, how much money do you put into this? Or so having those discussions every year, even as an interagency U.S. government team, could be very time consuming because you just got one number and then you had to divide it all up. Um, and so that wasn't without challenge, but you know, the benefit of it at the end of the day is that you do have, and especially if you run like a fully consultative process, is that you have the voice and the interests of the people you're trying to serve
Mhm.
embedded into that strategic and budget planning
Mhm.
document, which ultimately is the goal. And then it becomes your like reference for how you judge your results. So you set those goals out, and then you do the reporting, and these were these other cycles, right? So you set a goal like we're going to put 100,000 people on treatment. Well, then you have to report at the 6-month mark and the annual mark, like did we achieve those goals? If we didn't, why not? So it becomes like an important baseline and plan each year for accountability. So then it all comes back up to like the accountability. That information all goes back to Congress
Mhm.
eventually, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And the taxpayer, right? Like that's what it ultimately comes down to.
yeah, yeah.
And there are a lot of views on sort of how much work the cop was and how much detail and is that really necessary, and um over many years like that conversation has been ongoing, but I think you know now that I'm outside of it, especially, like, as a taxpayer, like, yeah, you wanna know that your money is accounted for, and
Mhm.
I think Congress felt pretty strongly about that at the time,
Mhm.
and there are a lot of different priorities, what's happened to PEPFAR over the many, many years, right?
Mhm.
Like, Ebola has popped up. Oh, yes, we have a pandemic. Like, there are other health, issues and challenges that come up in the space, and so in order to justify that continued focus on HIV and all that money, you have to provide that information.
Yeah.
That's kind of you know, what it turned into
Yeah. Yeah.
or what it was, yeah.
And then were there any kind of challenges in terms of budget, right? Because this was during the Obama years and the aftermath of the Great Recession. Was there
Yeah.
any kind of that?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly which year. Well, so I was in Nigeria, we had a large budget and it was kind of growing. When I went to Namibia, Um, Namibia had been doing well, like, in some of it reaching a lot of its own targets, like, goals, I'd say. I don't like the word target. Reaching its own, like, treatment goals and care goals and prevention goals. Um, and, it had reached, like, a different income status too. Like, I think for a few years, it was, like, an upper middle income country instead of a lower middle income country, and so this becomes interesting because the US government doesn't turn off foreign aid funding, based on an income status of a country. A lot of other countries do, like, a lot of European aid, was starting to dry up in Namibia when I
Mhm.
was there because they had become an upper middle income country, and, but PEPFAR money did not, but there was an expectation, and there were budget cuts, like, they weren't all PEPFAR as a global program wasn't always able to keep the high amount of funding that it had originally gotten. I don't remember all the years and all the levels, so but
Of course.
but it wasn't, but it certainly wasn't, as much as the beginning, and there were more countries, right? Like, so you started with a shorter list of countries, and then over time, there were more countries that were added to the program, so you have more demand on those money, right? And, yeah, so in Namibia, we had a trajectory that the funding was gonna be going down over, like, 5 years, and, so there was a lot of back and forth with headquarters around, like, "Well, how much is it gonna go down?" Like, they were really hesitant in DC to, like, tell us in country how much is it gonna go down so that we could plan. We were expected to do this 5-year partnership framework with the government of Namibia to sort of transition some of the programming, like, the US government was paying the PEPFAR program was paying for a lot of, staff salaries. It's called Human Resources for Health, like, a lot of the doctors and nurses and caregivers in the HIV program specifically, and so if that money was gonna go down, our negotiation with the government was that the government would pay for those healthcare workers, so there were these kinds of conversations, so you needed to know what that trajectory was gonna be. So the 3 years I was in Namibia, that's most what I spent most of my time on was, like, negotiating with DC about what our trajectory was gonna be, and then negotiating with the government to figure out, like, what's gonna happen to the program, like, what
Yeah.
is gonna be reduced from the US side, and then what can the Namibian government pick up.
Yeah. Yeah. And then on that conversation, you know, I'm trying to think of the way to ask this, but because PEPFAR has its own ambitions, but also the Global Fund has its own kind of way that countries can tap into it. How did you kind of like work together,
Yeah.
and what were the differences between the objectives, right, of like PEPFAR and the Global Fund?
I'm trying to think of the differences at the time, so I guess so in my experience in Namibia, especially because the funds were slated to go down, we had really intense discussions at the CCM, the Country and Coordinating Mechanism, like the board of the Global Fund, which I sat on and UNA sat on, the government sat on, like we all sit there. And so we would say, or we would have these discussions around like, okay, we think that the PEPFAR funding, US government funding, bilateral, is going to start going down. We don't know exactly by how much. But the Global Fund proposal process, like the rounds, um, um, what they wanna see in those proposals is how are you, um how are you, accounting for, like, it's explicit in there. You have to put in, like, what is PEPFAR paying for? Like, and what are other funders paying? And then what is the Global Fund expected to sort of not gap fill, but sort of, like, what is the Global Fund gonna cover? And so that's how it's all put together anyway. So, like, we come to the table with what we're gonna do, the government comes to the table with what they can do, and then we rewrite the funding proposal
Mhm.
together as a group.
Mhm.
Um, with consultants.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and then you put that proposal to the Global Fund. So the Global Fund proposals always had the assumptions from PEPFAR written into them, right?
Mhm.
So in that sense, like, it's always connected.
Yeah,
Um, some of the challenges at the time were that, you know, the Global Fund, I think in Namibia anyway, the US government PEPFAR program was funding the human resources. The Global Fund was paying for the AR antiretroviral the treatment medication, and that's always a very both of those challenges are difficult to um, change because you have to have a government that's available, willing and able to make to pick up those costs because you don't want people to not have treatment
of course.
when you've put them on treatment and now you're having to reduce your budget. So it's a very delicate, um, uh, um, an important issue, right? Like, so it has to be very well planned, like it
Yeah,
can't just be like, oh, sorry, we don't have the money anymore.
yeah,
And it wasn't like that,
yeah.
so it was this very intensive process. So we all worked together super closely. We didn't
Mhm.
always agree on what people should pay for and when they should do it, like the timing of it, but but it was, all done really closely together.
Yeah, yeah. And what were the conversations about? You had mentioned it previously about some of the things about like gender and family planning. You had mentioned, like male circumcision, but antiretroviral drugs, but also as well as like family planning. What kind of conversation, what did the conversations look like in the negotiating table?
Mm.
Yeah.
Family planning, I don't know if I did raise that because we didn't family planning. So when that's probably a topic generally that, like, changes the policies around, women's health and reproductive health and family planning change depending on the US president and policies like the Mexico City policy and other policies about what the US government money can be used for. So if you have a clinic that is investing in or is providing HIV treatment services um, during different phases, different policy timeframes, like you know, you can't also be providing abortion services, for example, right? Um, but you can provide like people are doing family planning in the sense of like reproductive health,
Mhm.
right? And so that wasn't really, I mean, to be honest, in my time in Nigeria and my time in Namibia, the family planning pieces were not, they weren't the things that, they weren't the topics that would hold us up. Like they weren't major topics of conflict in both of those places, and it could have just been, like, the time that I was there. It wasn't, but you also asked about, like well, I don't know, you asked about gender, I think. I mean, when we thought about gender in the technical guidance, because we would always get, like, technical policy guidance from technical experts around, like, gender-based violence and how that's a driver of the HIV, um, epidemic in different
Mhm.
localities, right? So, the gender comes up there, um and then also in some of the later years and well, the time I wasn't in the PEPFAR countries when this was happening, but there was a really a focus on women and girls and empowering women and girls, especially like, and there were special like subset um, central programming that would come for to really make sure that women had sort of control over their income and
Mhm.
their um, health. Yeah, so it's always been you know
Yeah.
part of the discussion, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So right now we're at 4:43, so it's been about an hour
Oh,
and
okay.
like 13 minutes. Like,
Sure.
how are you feeling? Are you feeling like you need a break? You could go a little bit longer.
I can go a little bit longer. It depends on how much long. Yeah, I'm gonna have to use the facilities a
Okay,
few minutes, but I can chat for a little bit more. I
okay.
mean,
Yeah, I think
you
we
want to go till
can.
5
Yeah, I think
or
we can go
what?
till 5,
Yeah,
and
that's
then
fine.
wherever we leave off of, we can plan for,
Yeah,
the second part of the
whatever
interview.
works.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm
yeah.
cool
So
for
I'll keep an
15
eye
more
on the
minutes.
watch
Okay.
for about 17 minutes,
Okay.
and then yeah, we'll move forward.
Yeah.
So, we've talked a little bit about, those conversations that you have had and your role with, the Global Fund and the conversations and PEPFAR. Um, And I wanted to ask you specifically about like the differences between
Mm,
working with, in terms of like public health, and in terms of like NGOs and FBOs.
mm,
Like what were like how did you work with both groups, in your time in Nigeria and Namibia?
mm. Well, I guess it really depended on kind of what the role was. So there were some groups that were like pure advocacy groups. And so we would make sure that we reached out to civil society in general when we were doing all of our consultations, like if we were doing a strategy or doing the COP, the budget planning or anything. Um, and all of the implementing agencies, so like USAID, their funding would go to NGOs predominantly. And so then they have like a contractual arrangement that they're responsible for, right? So there's a lot of like, there's oversight, right? So it's like an oversight relationship because they're implementing, you're giving them money to go out and do the work. Um, in terms of like the faith-based organizations, I mean, I I'm trying to remember like I can't remember like the exact names of all the groups in like Nigeria and Namibia. Um but in Nigeria, I don't remember like there were faith-based groups, but there were also like in terms of the like advocacy work on the ground in Nigeria, there were groups that were a little more had stronger voices that came from the um, communities of people living with HIV. Like there were a lot of like strong advocacy groups that kind of came from people living with HIV, right, and AIDS. And so for me, it was always like, and you'll see it in any like successful program. So there's like the policy-based conversation that was at the beginning of PEPFAR around like, you know, abstinence, be faithful, you what is it? Use a condom if necessary. Like the ABC policy. I won't
Mhm.
even go through it. So but I think that's what it was. But it's been a while since I thought about that. But so there were, and there were global faith-based groups that felt very strongly about those policies, right? Fine. Um, but at the local level, like when I was in Nigeria and in Namibia, I was mostly under the Obama administration, which changed those policies. So that's why I mean, like the policies of the president of the administration that's in did inform the programming in those ways. So that's one piece, like that policy environment. But either way, no matter what the sort of policies were, the faith-based organizations were critical to the success of the program, and I'm sure they still are. I'm not as close to it, like implementing,
Mhm.
currently, but I'm sure that if you talk to someone, which I'm sure you will on your list, like who's implementing the programs currently, faith-based organizations, I mean, you can't do this work without them. I mean, these are people that are in the communities, their churches, their mosques. I mean, this is who people trust. Even in the United States, like if you look at successful public health programs, you have to include, they're inclusive in terms of bringing in all religions and faith-based organizations. So it's I think not everyone always agrees on all of the policies, like the bigger policies, that maybe are in the environment. But in terms of like on the ground implementation, um, yeah, it's so important they're such critical partners. I mean, we even saw in northern Nigeria, partnering with with an imam that was in Kano, which is like the hub of the Muslim faith in Nigeria, in like all of northern Nigeria, and um, it was super interesting. Like we had a colleague on the CDC staff who's a local staff, Nigerian Muslim staff from that area, from northern Nigeria, and he um, he had built up so much trust in these communities up in the northern areas. Like there had been like an outbreak of polio. Polio is also a challenge in Nigeria, especially in northern Nigeria, and he had built up all this really like solid trust with the Muslim community, and the local imam, that they were able to do HIV programming there and also change the polio situation. Like they would they would allow the vaccines and things like that to happen because they had been shut down for a while because one of the religious leaders came out and said like it had caused these negative effects. But if you work closely with people and meet them where they are. I think that's the most important thing. And you can see a lot of success in the programming if you just talk to people.
Yeah, yeah.
Go out to where they are and just have a conversation about what's happening.
Mhm.
So really critical partners,
Yeah. I
my
mean,
experience.
yeah, it's super interesting, and it tells us about the
Yeah.
differences of implementation in places like Nigeria and Namibia, right? And
Yeah.
about religion,
Yeah.
about the difference between Christianity and Muslim
Yeah.
organizations. Yeah,
Yeah.
it tells us a lot.
Yeah, a little bit, but I think the big thing is, like, either way, like, or if they're like, whatever the religious organization is, like, just figuring out how you can partner together to address, like, a health challenge, right, in their community, right? It's where they live. It's not your place, it's their place. It's interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was definitely a learning, experience for me, that part of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we spent some time talking about, NGOs and FBOs, and I wanted to
Mm.
know what your experience was like, implementing PEPFAR policies and the differences between urban and rural settings, because there's that big
Oh.
difference.
Um, Let's think about. I mean, I guess what I would say is um, the differences that I noticed between even just living in Nigeria, which is how densely populated a place is. So if you think of urban and rural based on like population density as one of the initial like um, criteria or descriptors, um, that's actually what really came out to me during those experiences. So you can think of it as urban or rural, or like how densely populated a whole country is. So like in Nigeria, very densely populated. Especially if you're in Lagos trying to implement programs. I mean, um, and up in northern Nigeria in Kano, very densely populated, and just different dynamics occurring there in terms of like employment and where people are spending their time. Um, and so mostly it would come up in terms of like like logistical kinds of issues and challenges, right? Like, how are you getting treatment to a hospital or a clinic in an urban area? Well, maybe it's actually logistically a little bit easier because they're closer together, and you can figure out some of the logistics of that. Doing some of that work and community based, because there was a big emphasis on community based work in both countries. In Namibia, where it's the second least, at least when I was there, it was the second least densely populated country in the world after Mongolia, and that has real challenges for delivering healthcare, whatever healthcare, not just HIV, but all healthcare, like all of it, any of it, and all of it. And so, people can't really travel to get to a hospital, right? Like you have to be reliant on community-based healthcare. And so, in that environment, in Nigeria, community-based healthcare was important also, but you usually had more proximity to like a bigger hospital, so to speak, like in the way that we think of hospitals or experience hospitals. But in Namibia, when your population is very rural, I guess you'd think, or at least um, not densely populated, sparsely populated, it's just really different challenges logistically to try to reach people and bring them into care and treatment and
Yeah.
even get them tested for HIV. And then how do you do the follow up? And lost to treatment is a big issue, and we haven't even talked about TB. But yeah, just different challenges. But I really think of the urban rural piece, at least in my experience, was about population density in
Okay.
those environments
Yeah.
and the differences.
And was this the same experiences that you encountered with clinics as well? Because you mentioned hospitals, but was it the same with clinics, or was it different?
Yeah, I guess it depended on the country. So like, if you're um like Nigeria had what was called a hub and spoke model, right? So, you have a major or like tertiary care, like a lot of it was like primary, secondary, tertiary care kind of environment where, a lot of people didn't go to hospital, so to speak, unless they had a major issue. But sometimes the hospitals were the only place where the treatment ARV drugs were being dispensed. And so people would have to travel really far. So over time, what we learned in PEPFAR and what with the Ministry of Health and the local government was that you really had to get those services out through decentralization. So yeah, clinics are part of health clinics that are. I think those usually you think of those as like secondary. Um, care, and then tertiary are still health clinics or also like just really community based door to door, treat, health programs. Um, but yeah, I mean, health clinics um, were important, and there were always conversations around like, well, is the HIV program, is it integrated within the hospital or is it like a standalone clinic or a standalone program? And that was always I don't know what the status is of all of the programs now and the clinics in the countries, but that was something that, because this money had come in just for HIV, in a lot of places you had the HIV clinic and then you had the rest of the hospital. And, you know, is that the best way to implement, or should it be fully integrated where you go in for your regular primary care visit and you can also get your HIV services? You don't have to go to the HIV clinic,
Hmm.
in order to get your so those issues would come up, and
Okay.
depending on how the Ministry of Health wanted to resolve them.
Okay. And then you talked about the tertiary. Can you just elaborate about what the
Yeah.
tertiary
That's
is?
more like the super local, like in the community.
Okay.
Yeah. That's how I think of it. Like your
Okay.
primary is like your big hospital, like or maybe in the major city, whatever the major city might be, and then like your secondary might be like the primary care, like a smaller hospital in like a city, that smaller town or city, and then the tertiary is like your super small clinic out in a rural area, or like a community health, a center for like community health workers.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay.
that's yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
That's how that was used, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah.
No worries. And then, I think we'll end with this
Yeah,
question
okay.
because we're about
Yep.
4:55. Tell us about your transition. We've already kind of spent some time talking about the roles in the different countries, but the transition from country coordinator from Nigeria to Namibia, like what influenced that transition?
Oh, for me to move, to
Yeah.
pick it, to try to go to a different country?
Yeah.
I mean, mostly, um, a lot of the folks who if you go and work in Nigeria, the assignments are for 2 years. The assignment is for 2 years. You can extend, for like a third or a fourth. That wasn't as common in Nigeria because it can be a tough place to work and to have your family there and stuff like that. Um, we had ended up going to Namibia for like a meeting at some point, and the role opened up and I wanted to, like, when I was talking about the different like population density kind of challenges and the different challenges with implementation, um, and the fact that it was an upper middle income country, I kind of wanted to go to a country that had just sort of a different, yeah, just different issues, different challenges, and uh, and that role opened up, and so I was able to move into it, and yeah, and it was interesting on a whole other level, like just different things happening. A lot of, I mean, sparsely populated, so the challenge is there, but uh, the U.S. government considered it a little more safe, I guess, for us, so we could travel a lot. So it was nice to be able to have that freedom in Namibia, to be able to travel and go out to the clinics and go out and see people and work with people a little more closely. So that was helpful. Yeah. And then I was there for 3 years, and that was the end of my, like, tour, so to speak, or my,
Mhm.
like, assignment, and so, we could have stayed longer probably there also, but, it does take a toll on the family over the years,
Yeah.
like, it's a lot of either moving or just being far away from family, and, um, so we decided to move back to the US and be near family, and I went back to grad school, because I hadn't still gone to grad school after all of that. I just kept finding these really interesting jobs, and was learning a lot, and so, like, kept kind of following that path, and then I was like, "Maybe it's a good time to, like, process all of this and go back." So it was good, yeah, so
Mm.
that's kinda what we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, my daughter was entering she had finished kindergarten, so we're like, "Might as well bring her back to the US and see what
Yeah.
see what elementary school is like," and, so part of that life is, like, the personal and the professional, like, linked up, right? I guess
Mhm.
like any job or any choice you make,
Right.
about where you wanna move and live,
Yeah. Yeah.
if you are in a partnership and have a family, however that works, or yeah,
Yeah, and it makes sense. It's
you
kind
have
of the
to.
natural transition, right? Your
Yeah.
daughter was moving into,
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah, that's
Mm.
kinda what it was for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.